For $3, she bought the mountain man they called a beast. Then he sat and braided her hair in silence. The small frontier town of Red Hollow sat quietly between dry hills and tall pine forests. Dusty roads ran through the town, and wooden buildings lined the streets. Life there was simple. People worked hard, minded their own business, and trusted only those they knew. But there was one man the town never trusted. People spoke about him in whispers. High up in the mountains lived a tall, silent man. He rarely came into town, but when he did, people stared and quickly moved out his way. His beard was thick and wild, his clothes were worn and patched, and his eyes looked serious and distant. Because of this, the townspeople gave him a name. They called him the Beast. No one really knew his real name. Some said he had lived alone in the mountains for many years. Others believed he had once been part of town, but had left after something sad happened in his life. But no one knew the truth, because the man hardly spoke to anyone. He simply came to town sometimes to trade furs, buy supplies, and then disappear back into the mountains. And every time he appeared, the town became quiet. People avoided him. Children were pulled closer to their parents. Shopkeepers spoke quickly so he would leave sooner. The strange thing was, no one could say he had ever hurt anyone. Still, the name, the Beast, stayed with him. One bright autumn morning, the town square was busier than usual. Ranchers and farmers had gathered to hire workers for small jobs before winter arrived. Wooden wagons stood near the road, and groups of men talked while waiting to be chosen for work. Standing among them was a young woman named Clara Whitfield. Clara had only arrived in Red Hollow 3 days earlier. She had traveled a long way after learning that her late father had left her a small cabin just outside the town. The cabin was old, and the land around it needed work. But Clara did not complain. She had soft brown hair, calm eyes, and a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Even though she was new in town, she walked through the square with confidence. Still, she had a problem. Clara had very little money left. Inside her small cloth purse were only $3. She had hoped to hire someone to help fix the broken fence around her cabin and carry supplies from town. But as she listened to the workers talking, she quickly realized something. Most men were asking for much more money than she had. $5, $7. Some even asked for 10. Clara felt a small wave of worry. She stepped aside near the wooden well in the center of the square and thought quietly. That was when she noticed him. Standing alone near the edge of the crowd was the tall mountain man everyone feared. He was easy to recognize. His coat looked old but strong, made from thick leather and fur. His boots were dusty from long walks through the mountains. His dark beard covered most of his face, and his shoulders were broad, like someone used to hard work. But what stood out most was the way people avoided standing near him. There was empty space all around him. No one spoke to him. No one even looked directly at him. He simply stood there silently, holding a small sack of supplies, waiting like everyone else. Clara watched the scene carefully. She noticed something others seemed to ignore. The man did not look angry. He did not look dangerous. He simply looked alone. 2 men nearby whispered quietly. "That's the mountain man," one said. "The Beast," the other replied. "Best stay away." Clara listened but said nothing. Instead, she looked again at the tall man. Then she looked down at the $3 in her hand. Most people in town saw a frightening stranger, but Clara saw something different. She saw a man no one was willing to trust. After a moment of quiet thought, Clara made a decision. She took a slow breath and walked across the town square. People began to notice. A few heads turned. The closer she walked toward the mountain man, the more surprised the townspeople became. One shopkeeper even leaned forward to see better. The tall man noticed her footsteps and slowly lifted his eyes. For a moment, the noisy town square seemed to grow quiet. Clara stopped in front of him. Up close, he looked even taller than she expected. But his eyes were calm, not wild like the stories people told. She opened her small purse and held out the money in her hand. $3. Her voice was steady and polite. "Sir," she said, "I have a cabin outside town that needs some work. It's not much money, but would you help me for the day?" For a second, no one moved. The nearby workers stared. A man dropped a small tool he was holding. Even the shopkeeper froze in place. The woman who had just arrived in town had offered $3 to hire the man everyone called the Beast. The mountain man looked at the money. Then he looked at Clara. The square remained silent. Approximate 750 words, third person, simple English, violence-free. For a few long seconds, the town square stayed silent. Everyone waited to see what the mountain man would do. Clara still held the $3 in her hand. She did not pull her hand back. Her face stayed calm, even though she could feel many people watching her. The tall man looked down at the money. Then he slowly lifted his eyes to look at Clara. His eyes were not angry. They were quiet and thoughtful. For a moment, it seemed like he was deciding something important. Then, without saying a word, the mountain man gently reached out and took the $3. A soft wave of whispers moved through the crowd. He took it. Did you see that? Why would she hire him? But the mountain man paid no attention to the voices. He simply placed the money inside his coat pocket and gave Clara a small nod. It was not a big gesture, but it clearly meant yes. Clara smiled politely. "Thank you," she said. The mountain man did not answer, but he stepped closer to the wooden wagon where Clara had placed her small bags of supplies. Without asking, he lifted the heaviest sack onto his shoulder, as if it weighed almost nothing. Clara picked up a smaller basket. Then the two of them began walking out of the town. Behind them, people continued whispering. Some shook their heads. Others looked worried. One older rancher muttered, "That girl must be braver than she looks." The road leading away from Red Hollow was long and dusty. Tall pine trees stood along the path, and the mountains rose high in the distance. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The mountain man walked a few steps ahead, carrying the supplies with steady strength. Clara followed beside him, matching his pace. Even though he looked rough and wild, his steps were calm and careful. After some time, Clara decided to speak. "My cabin isn't very far," she said kindly. "About 2 hours from town." The mountain man nodded once. That was his only answer. Clara did not feel uncomfortable, though the silence between them was not heavy or strange. It was simply quiet. After walking for nearly 30 minutes, the road became a little steeper. The path curved through tall trees, and the wind moved softly through branches. Clara noticed something small. The strap of her lantern had become loose, and it kept slipping from the side of her basket. She tried to fix it while walking, but it was difficult. The mountain man noticed. Without saying anything, he stopped walking. Clara paused too. He gently set down the sack of supplies and held out his hand toward the lantern. Clara looked slightly surprised but handed it to him. The man carefully examined the loose strap. His large hands moved slowly and patiently. Within a few seconds, he tied the strap tighter and made a small knot so it would not slip again. Then he handed the lantern back. Clara smiled warmly. "Thank you." The mountain man simply nodded again. They continued walking. As the sun slowly climbed higher in the sky, the forest around them became peaceful and bright. Birds sang in the distance, and the smell of pine filled the cool air. Clara began to notice more things about the quiet man walking beside her. He never rushed. He never complained. Even though he carried the heavy sack the entire time, he walked steadily and calmly. Once, when the road became rocky, he moved a few loose stones aside with his boot so Clara could walk more easily. It was a small act of kindness, but Clara noticed. About an hour later, they reached a small wooden bridge that crossed a narrow stream. The clear water moved gently over smooth rocks. Clara stopped for a moment and looked at the mountains in the distance. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. The mountain man looked toward the mountains as well. For a moment, something in his eyes changed. It looked like he knew these mountains very well. Maybe they had been his home for a long time. After a short rest, they continued walking. Soon, the trees began to thin, and a small clearing appeared ahead. At the center of the clearing stood a simple wooden cabin. The roof was a little crooked, and the fence around the land was partly broken. A small garden area near the cabin had not been taken care of in a long time, but the place still looked peaceful. Clara smiled when she saw it. "This is it," she said. The mountain man stopped near the fence and looked at the cabin quietly. Without being asked, He set the sack of supplies down and walked toward the broken fence posts. He examined the wood carefully. Then he rolled up the sleeves of his old coat. Clara watched with curiosity. The man the town called the Beast had not said more than a few words, but the way he moved, the way he fixed things, and the quiet care he showed made something very clear. He was not a wild man. He was simply someone who knew how to work, and someone who had spent a long time living alone. And as Clara watched him begin repairing the fence, she felt certain about one thing. The afternoon sun slowly moved across the sky as the mountain man worked around Clara's cabin. He moved quietly and carefully, like someone who had done this kind of work many times before. First, he repaired the broken fence. He removed the old weak posts and pushed them deeper into the ground so they would stand strong. Clara watched from the porch while sorting the small supplies she had bought in town. Every now and then she looked up. The man worked without stopping. He never asked for instructions. He simply looked at what needed to be done and began fixing it. Soon the fence around the cabin started to look straight again. After that, he carried several pieces of fallen wood from the edge of the clearing and stacked them neatly beside the cabin wall. The pile became larger and more organized with every trip. Clara noticed something interesting. Even though the man looked rough and quiet, he was very careful with everything. When he placed the wood down, he did it slowly so the pieces would not fall apart. When he used tools, he cleaned them before setting them down. Nothing about his work looked careless. By late afternoon, the cabin already looked much better. Clara stepped down from the porch and walked toward him. "You've done a lot already," she said kindly. "You must be tired." The mountain man shook his head slightly. "Tired later," he said in a quiet voice. It was one of the few times he had spoken. Clara smiled. She realized his voice was calm and deep, not rough or frightening like the stories people told about him. She walked over to the small water bucket near the porch and filled a cup. "Here," she said, offering it to him. The mountain man accepted the cup with a small nod and drank slowly. After finishing, he handed it back with a quiet, "Thank you." Clara noticed something else then. His manners were gentle. He never grabbed things quickly or acted impatiently. When he spoke, his voice was respectful. As the sun slowly began to lower behind the mountains, the air became cooler. The mountain man finished repairing the last fence post and stepped back to look at the work. The fence now stood straight and strong around the cabin. Clara looked around the clearing with satisfaction. "It looks so much better already," she said. The man did not answer, but his eyes carefully checked the work again to make sure everything was secure. Then he picked up a small hammer and quietly fixed the loose hinge on Clara's cabin door. The door now opened smoothly without making the old creaking sound. Clara laughed softly. "I didn't even tell you about that problem." The mountain man shrugged slightly. "I heard it," he said. Clara could not help smiling again. By the time the work was finished, the sky had turned soft orange and gold. The mountains in the distance looked peaceful in the evening light. Clara sat down on the wooden porch steps. She was tired from the long walk earlier, but she felt happy seeing the cabin slowly coming back to life. The mountain man wiped his hands on a cloth and prepared to gather his coat. It seemed like he was ready to leave. Clara picked up her hairbrush and began brushing her long brown hair while watching the sunset. The wind had made small tangles in it during the walk from town. She brushed slowly, but one section near the back became badly tangled. She tried again. The brush got stuck. Clara sighed quietly and tried to untangle the knot with her fingers. Behind her, the mountain man had been about to step away, but he stopped. For a moment, he simply watched. Clara did not notice. She was still trying to untangle her hair. After a few seconds, the mountain man slowly walked back toward the porch. His footsteps were quiet. Clara looked up slightly when she noticed him nearby. He did not speak. Instead, he gently held out his hand toward the brush. Clara blinked in surprise. "You want the brush?" she asked softly. The man gave a small nod. There was no strange look in his eyes, only quiet patience. Curious, Clara handed him the brush. The mountain man sat carefully on the porch step behind her. Then, with slow and steady movements, he began working on a tangled section of her hair. His hands were large but surprisingly gentle. He moved the brush slowly so it would not pull. Within a few moments, the knot loosened. Clara sat very still. She was surprised, but she also felt strangely calm. The wind moved softly through the trees around the cabin as the evening became quieter. The mountain man continued brushing until her hair was smooth again. Then he carefully divided it into sections and began braiding it. His movements were slow and patient, as if he had done this many times before. Clara finally spoke, her voice curious but soft. "You braid hair very well." The mountain man did not stop working. For a moment he said nothing. Then he answered quietly, "Long time ago, I learned." The braids slowly formed down her back as the sun dipped lower behind the mountains. And in that peaceful moment, Clara realized something important. The man the town had called the Beast was not frightening at all. The evening air around the small cabin was calm and cool. The sun had almost disappeared behind the tall mountains, leaving soft orange light across the sky. The forest was quiet except for the gentle sound of wind moving through the pine trees. Clara sat still on the wooden porch while the mountain man finished braiding her hair. His hands moved slowly and carefully, making sure each section was neat. He did not rush. Every movement showed patience and quiet care. When the braid was finished, he tied the end with a small piece of string from his pocket. Then he stepped back. Clara touched the braid and smiled. "It's perfect," she said warmly. The mountain man gave a small nod, but he did not say anything more. For a moment, the two of them simply sat there in silence, watching the evening sky grow darker. After a while, Clara turned slightly so she could look at him. "You learned that a long time ago?" she asked. The mountain man looked down at the wooden porch for a moment. Then he answered quietly, "My little sister." Clara listened carefully. "She had long hair like yours," he continued softly. "She didn't like when it tangled, so I learned to braid it." His voice stayed calm, but there was something thoughtful in his eyes. Clara understood that the memory was important to him. She did not ask more questions. Instead, she simply said, "She must have trusted you a lot." The mountain man gave a small, quiet nod. The night air slowly grew cooler. Stars began appearing above the mountains one by one. The work around the cabin was finished now. The fence stood straight. The woodpile was neat, and the door worked properly again. Clara looked around the clearing. Earlier that morning, the place had looked tired and forgotten. Now it felt alive again. "You worked very hard today," Clara said kindly. "Thank you." The mountain man stood up slowly and picked up his coat. It looked like he was ready to begin the long walk back toward the mountains. Clara watched him for a moment. She remembered how the people in town had looked at him with fear. But after spending the whole day with him, she knew something very different. He was not dangerous. He was not wild. He was simply a quiet man who had been alone for a very long time. As he turned to leave, Clara spoke again. "You don't have to walk all the way back tonight." The mountain man paused. He looked back at her, slightly confused. Clara stood from the porch. "There's extra space in the shed beside the cabin," she explained. "It's simple, but it's warm. You could stay the night." For a moment, the mountain man did not move. It seemed like he was not used to being offered a place to stay. Clara continued gently. "You helped me more than I expected today. And tomorrow there's still work to do in the garden and the roof." She smiled kindly. "If you want to stay and work here, I can pay you when I have more money." The mountain man looked toward the dark forest for a moment. The mountains had been his home for many years. Up there, he lived alone with the quiet wind and tall trees. But tonight was different. For the first time in a long while, someone had spoken to him without fear. Someone had trusted him. Slowly, he looked back at the small cabin. The porch light glowed softly beside Clara, and the repaired fence stood strong around the clearing. It felt peaceful. After a long moment, the mountain man gave a small nod. Clara smiled. "I'll bring a lantern," she said. She walked toward the shed beside the cabin and opened the door. Inside, there was a simple bed made from blankets and straw. It was not fancy, but it was warm. The mountain man stepped inside and looked around quietly. Clara placed a lantern on a small wooden box. "This should be comfortable enough," she said. He looked at the lantern light, then at Clara. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was only 2 words, but they carried a lot of meaning. Clara nodded and walked back toward the cabin. Before going inside, She looked once more toward the shed. The town of Red Hollow believed the mountain man was a beast, but Clara knew the truth. He was simply a man who had never been given a place to belong. That night, under the quiet mountain stars, something small but important had changed. For $3, Clara had hired the man the town feared. But what she truly gave him was something far more valuable. She gave him trust.